Hi, I'm Will Johnson, also known as Power Nerd Insights. I work as a senior Power Platform specialist for Vantage 365, and I'd like to welcome you to this Power Nerd presentation. Okay then, so good afternoon everyone. Welcome to this Friday learning session. My name is Will Johnson, also known as Power Nerd Insights. I have been a senior Power Platform developer for the past 4 years. I'm currently working for a consultancy called Vantage 365. And yeah, essentially I do everything Power Platform. I'm a bit of a nerd about it, and I like to be able to teach, so that's what this session's about. This specific session is going to be on environment variables. The main reason for this is environment variables are actually really powerful in terms of stepping up your application lifecycle management and some of your other bits as well. And they're actually quite key to unlocking that. So we're going to be going through them today. And as always, we do have a bit of an agenda. So we have the introduction. That's where we are now. Great to see everybody. We will have basically a section on what environment variables are. So giving just a brief overview of what they are, what their intent is, what they're supposed to be kind of doing. We're going to look at how they work. So, this is, how are they structured, what data is retained where, and also how they kind of might change or how we interact with them. We're then going to go on to how we create them. In that how do we create them section, we're going to look at essentially how you build one, but also the different types of environment variable data types that are out there and some of their use cases. We're then also going to obviously be looking at what they can be used for. So that is going to include a bit of a live demonstration in terms of adding them into a Canvas app, using them in that Canvas app, and using them in Power Automate. And then, as usual, we always have a discussion piece on the very end. This is a free and open conversation bit to talk around the topic. If you have questions, you're welcome to ask them then. But during the course of the call, you can obviously drop them in the chat as well. But that gives us an open space for everybody to ask questions, provide their insight, and kind of talk about their experiences with either environment variables or Power Platform as a whole. So, like I said, bit of a good agenda today. We're going to be covering quite a fair bit. But first things first, as always, we do a rules of engagement. Now, this is essentially just a brief piece to describe how these sessions normally work. So, for the majority of the session, I'll be the one talking. Um, if you have any questions, please do post them in the chat during the course of the session. But like I said, in the discussion section, your mics will be opened up. You'll be allowed to request to speak, and we'll get you up onto the stage to talk. I am a firm believer in there is no such thing as a stupid question. This is an environment for people to learn. And I really do implore you to try and test that theory of there is no such thing as a stupid question. I have a 4-year-old daughter. She makes an attempt at trying to ask the stupidest questions she can. We haven't found one yet that has not been interesting, so please do ask. That being said, let's move on. The very first part, environment variables. Well, what actually are they? Well, environment variables are very simply a way that Power Platform has and Microsoft have enabled us to store and manage kind of configuration data that changes between environments and deployments of a solution. Okay, so best way I can think of it is think of it like a box that you put information in, and then when you go and move house, you take the old information out and you put the new information in. There was a brilliant analogy I heard for this. It's the deeds to your house. It's the filing structure. You keep the deeds to your house in. You take the file box with you, but when you leave the house, you leave the old stuff there, the old deeds there, and then when you move it to the new one, you put the new deeds in. Very simply, that's what it does. It's a way to store that information and move it. But that information can take many different forms, and we'll discuss those kind of a little bit later in the session. But that's what they are. Um, they do actually, while they sound relatively simple in terms of what they are, they do actually unlock a lot of functionality for us. So, how do they actually work? Well, these are actually the environment variables are Dataverse table enabled. There are two tables within Dataverse, within the Dataverse enabled environment that are created as standard tables. These are called environment variable definition and environment variable value. These tables store a bit of information about your environment variables, and the way in terms of we interact with them, you add them to a solution. We'll show that in the how they're created section. And then when we export a solution and then go to import it into another environment, let's say we're taking it from dev to test. If you import it as a managed solution, you'll get a nice little panel up on the side. We normally see this for things like connection references. There then becomes a second panel for you to update the environment variable values that are present within that solution. Okay, and we'll get to see that today because we're going to be essentially adding a few environment variables to a solution that I have pre-made, and then kind of showing that through. Now, when we look at it being a Dataverse table enabled, there is a bit of a trick to it. So I'm actually going to show these two Dataverse tables now. So if I just tab over to here. So there are two tables. There is the environment variables definition table. This, as it says there, contains information about the settable variables. So this is things like its type. As I said, there are multiple different types. Its default value. So this is a value that it always jumps back to if there's not a current value added, and a few other bits of information like its schema name, its obviously display name, and these are all things that we set kind of from there. Now there are a few other columns in there in terms of API ID and connection reference that are unique to certain data, certain environment variable types, but really a lot of the time, you know, you're going to be looking at the standard one in terms of when they created the schema name, display name, and a few other bits there. And the environment variable definition, as I said, has a type column, which shows you what the type is. Now, the other table that's in there is environment variable value. Now, we'll get to see this when we create them, but when you create an environment variable, there are two values that you can associate with a environment variable. Obviously, I said before that they're used as a way to contain information that changes between environments. There's the default value, which is defined in that environment variable definition table, which is what it falls back to. The current value is stored in the environment variable value table. Okay, the current value is what is going to appear in your environment variable when you use it. If the current value is blank, it falls back on the default value. We'll see that again when we change things. So you can see in here, I've got a load of environment variable values in here that do a range of other things. I've got a JSON one, a text one, a Boolean one, and a few others, right? Now, these two tables put together are what define our environment variable values. This one is very simply just a value column, and the other one defines kind of more of the content, more of the structure of the environment variable. So it's worthwhile noting about these two tables because you can actually do a lot in terms of pulling these two tables in. So when we're looking to use certain environment variable types in, let's say, a Canvas app, we're going to need to add these environment variable definition and value tables to our Canvas app to be able to pull them in. Now, obviously, they are Dataverse tables. So if you're pulling them into a Canvas app, it's going to pull up the requirement for premium licensing on that front. Okay, so something to be aware of that when you're using environment variables a lot of the time, if you're trying to use them in Canvas apps for anything other than a data source type environment variable, again, we'll look at that later, you will need to have a premium license in that aspect. So that being said, we've looked at obviously how they're structured to some degree in terms of the how do they work. We can see that they're Dataverse table enabled. We know I've obviously mentioned that they're update on import solution. We'll see that a bit later. But how do we create them? Now this is the big thing. Environment variables have to be created inside of a solution. So you can see here I've got a nice little environment variable solution prepped and ready. Bear with me one moment. Just there. So we've got an environment variable solution prepped and ready there for us to look at. So now we're going to look at how we create them. As I said, they have to be created inside a solution, but there are multiple different types of environment variable. As you can see here, I've got a Boolean one, a Dataverse one, a JSON one, a SharePoint list, SharePoint site, and SharePoint text, but they all look like they're exactly the same. To actually create one, it's very easy. We come to New, we go to More, and we go to Environment Variable. We give it a display name, so I'm going to call this one email. And then we choose a data type. Now, as I said, there are a few data types here, so we've got a total of 6. So the first one, decimal number. Well, this is what it says on the tin. It's used to store number data. Now, common use case for this that I've seen, it could be really useful for things like sales discount rates or tax calculation rates that might be different between deployments or between environments. For example, if you were deploying a custom built application that dealt with sales or international sales into a client that's in a different country, you could add a decimal number environment variable to set what their tax rate is. For instance, obviously UK value added tax is 20% on certain products, so I could put a 1.2 in there, and great. Now I can use that environment variable to calculate against anything I need to calculate sales tax on by pulling the environment variable in and setting it there. Really kind of useful for that aspect of things, and that's where I've seen it most commonly used. We have JSON. Now, JSON obviously accepts a JSON object. You can see here, I can just drop one in. That's our default value. We could put a current value in there. So, as I said, defines a JSON object or a JSON kind of array. Using this, you can store things like a theme setup or other items in a JSON object and access them in an app via the environment variable values table. We'll give a quick show of that in a minute. These environment, you can then test that environment variable and the objects within the JSON tree by obviously if you didn't make it to last week's session, we did a session on navigating JSON trees via Power Automate, same principle. But you navigate it in Power Apps by writing out themes dot colors dot primary dot let's say primary 2, for instance. Using this, you can kind of navigate down, and it allows you to structure that JSON object in that way and make it accessible. This is really useful for if you have, let's say, for instance, a few developers who don't know what environment they're in entirely all the time. You can set the the theming of an app to essentially be the primary color in dev is blue, but the primary color in test or production is red, right? And then as long as you structure your app using this environment variable, you can change them kind of as we go. It also means if you're using it this way, you can do things like, I don't know, let's say you turn around and you have a section in your JSON object for, is it a Boolean in there that's, is this dev environment? Yes, no. Well, you can use that to essentially identify whether you're in a dev environment or not, having it been set from the import, and then kind of pick it up from there. We then have text. This one is actually really useful for holding things like error reporting emails. So if you're running in Power Automate and you're running a try catch kind of scope setup in Power Automate, and you have a very specific error reporting email you want it to send to, and that error reporting email changes depending on the environment variable, you can actually drop that into here. So for instance, I could put my tenant email in here, and then that's saved away. When I obviously go to import that, I can change that to, let's say, someone else's email, because I'm responsible for the errors that appear in dev, but someone else on the support team might be responsible for the errors that appear in, let's say, test or production. That's their responsibility. They should get the notification emails rather than myself. Um, you can reference environment variables from Power Automate to kind of make them nice and easy to change. The other thing as well it can be used for, and I've seen this done quite often, is if you have, let's say, an email template that's really nice and pretty, it's been HTML'd, and you don't want that to appear as a huge HTML block in your Outlook actions, you can actually use this text environment variable to hold that HTML template for that email and then call it in Power Automate, add it in on the Outlook connector, and kind of have it here rather than holding it, let's say, in the actual Power Automate itself. This becomes really powerful for one reason when you're using it like that, because let's say you have to send that email template in 5 different Power Automate flows, and then all of a sudden they decide, oh, as a customer, they want to change that email template, and they provide you it, once. You then have to go in without this and change 5 different flows to use that new email template. Whereas if you were operating in this method, you'd essentially just change the environment variable and then it would reflect on all the other Power Automates. But text can be used quite a lot. Then we have a Boolean setup. So this is very simple, a yes, no, reports as true or false. I've only ever seen this used in one way. I'd be interested to hear if anybody else has any examples of it. But the way I've seen it used is an environment variable that's called is this dev, and they test whether it's true or false in the app or in the Power Automate, and then from there they decide what to do. Um, if it's yes, for instance, set the color of I don't know, a button to be red, or disable a button, or for instance, one really good one actually was they were using this is this dev to hide and show debug buttons and labels inside of an application. So that the debug kind of buttons, menus, and kind of labels that they were using to identify the value of variables was only visible in dev if this environment variable was set to yes. Obviously, you can do that by just querying the current environment that the application is in. That's not too hard to do. But what that means is you then have to account for if you're moving this solution into other dev areas, and then it turns into a switch statement and it becomes a bit longer. At least with this, you can just put it in one place and then set whether it's yes or no on the import. Next one we have down is data source. Now, personally, I think this one is probably the most powerful environment variable data type there is. It's exceptionally useful for SharePoint-backed Canvas apps, and there is a good reason why. Um, you can see here, once I've selected data source, there's a connector option here, and we've got a few data source kind of connection options. So SharePoint, SQL Server, Microsoft Dataverse, and SAP ERP. The reason why I feel like the data source one is probably the most powerful one is because it actually enables you to carry out proper application lifecycle management without the need to introduce unmanaged changes for SharePoint-backed Canvas apps. So if I choose the SharePoint connector here, it'll ask me to choose a connection, but then it'll ask for a parameter type. Now you can see here I've got two options. I can choose site or list. If I choose site, it's going to ask me to choose a current site value. So we just click here. And you can see there, I've got a list of sites. I don't know what's going on with this. It used to show everything, but as of yesterday, it decided to not show everything now. So you just get the end of the URL, which isn't very helpful. But if I choose a site, let's say my dev project site there, and then I hit save, what that's going to do is that's going to save that site's URL in the environment variable value for values table for this environment variable that I'm creating. The other option I've got on here is list. Now, this works slightly differently. You can see here it opens up a site option. I then have to choose a environment variable that is already set as the parameter type of site. So you can see here I've got a SharePoint site one there. If I click on SharePoint site, what that's going to do is that's then going to give me a list of all the lists that are available in the site that is currently selected in this SharePoint site variable. So if I turn around and I say, well, actually, this one's going to be questions and hit save, what that's going to do is it's going to save the list ID or the list GUID that represents that library into the environment variable values. So what I'll do is I'll just quickly show. You can see here I've got SharePoint site. This is one that I set up earlier. True blue Peter fashion there. Dev, it's set up. And I've got a SharePoint list one here. If I edit that, that's looking at my projects list, which is great. If I were to come into the environment variable values table and I look for the P&I SharePoint site, the value that's currently in that, which is the SharePoint site environment variable I'd identified, is the URL. And then if I look for the next one down, we've got P&I SharePoint list. You can see that's the list GUID. Now, the reason that's useful is purely because you can actually use that to reference those two setups to reference the data, use them as references as data sources in a Canvas app, or even use them in as dynamic content in Power Automate. And we'll actually show that in terms of what they can be used for. But moving on from the SharePoint one, the other option we have is SQL Server. So the SQL basically server data connector option allows you to reference different databases, and you can then change the reference to that database on the import of the solution. So let's say you've got an SQL database that is that is specific to dev data, and that's where you want to start putting dev items. You're not going to be want to be working on the production database. You'd use an environment variable to reference that, and then off you go from there. When you then import it, you can change the reference in the environment variable, and then it then starts targeting the production database. Very simple, very easy. It also means, like I said, you don't have to go in and then introduce unmanaged changes while you're editing things like Power Automate and Canvas apps to get it to reference the right thing, because this will do all that referencing for you. The Dataverse connector is a little bit different. You would expect that it would give you a reference to a table, but it doesn't. You can actually reference a different environment. So essentially what this enables you to do is add tables from another environment into your Canvas apps. So if you use an external table from a different environment via the change environment option in Canvas apps, which I can show in a minute, then that Canvas app assumes that you want to always refer to that exact same table in that exact same environment. But if you need so if you need to have it changed to refer to a different table in a different environment, you need an environment variable. Um, this is how that's set up. So when we look at this, we set it up as, let's say, I'm going to drop in JSys dev environment and go from there. We can have it pull information from that, and then when I go to import it into either dev or into test or prod, I can change that environment variable, and it will change into different change to select tables from that different environment there. And then we have the SAP ERP. I'm going to hold my hands up. I haven't done much with SAP ERP, but having a good solid look at it, it works the same in terms of the SQL Server. You can define a SAP ERP database, change that reference to, again, move it through dev test prod, and then it pulls data. The data type is quite definitive in that it is a data source. It's where you're pulling data from. And then we have Secret. Now, this is relatively useful. Personally, I have not had the opportunity to use it in a work context yet. It's something I am looking to do, but having done a fair bit of research, because we may have it be brought up in a recent kind of client that's been brought on. This allows you to essentially connect to Azure Key Vault, and then define a secret. So you can see here, once I choose Azure Key Vault, it's going to ask for an Azure subscription ID, a resource group name, the Key Vault name, and the secret name to then be able to pull an Azure secret and keep it secure. What this means is that if you have this set up, you can stop individuals from being able to expose Azure secrets and using them directly in your kind of in your Power Automate kind of space. Again, would be really happy if anybody had any kind of comments on this or feedback on this, but personally, I have yet to use it. But yeah, those are all the data types of environment variables, kind of some common use cases for them, and how they might be useful. Taking a bit of a pause there, because we are about to move on to the next section. Obviously, while I've listed some use cases, these are not all of the use cases that these could be used for. There are different things that things like the text one can be used for. There are different things that the JSON object can be used for, and all sorts. But that being said, we now know how to create them. So what can they actually be used for? Um, the big one here, SharePoint Backdate Application Lifecycle Management. That's what my demo to at this point is going to focus on. But things like storing emails and referencing Azure secrets. So that storing emails is more about the HTML design of an email, and making sure that we can reference that in one location. But how do we actually put environment variables into our Power Apps and our flows? Well, that's relatively easy, he says. What we do is in Canvas apps, the way to add them in, if you come to here over on the data tab, you add the environment variable values and environment variable definitions table. Now this is the way to add anything that isn't a data source environment variable. We then can look at the environment variable by running a lookup function. So you can see here I've got a text value there. So that's my text environment variable value that I have in here. So if I just look at the text environment variable value, you can see here we are currently in the dev kitchen environment. And because I've referenced the value option from that environment variable value from the environment variable values table, it's displaying that in a text variable. Relatively easy to get a hold of, relatively easy to use and get in once these are in here. But that doesn't allow you to really make full use of the data source kind of data source kind of activities. So what do we need? What do we do if we want to add a, let's say, a SharePoint site and list via an environment variable value? We can hit add data. We come in, we type SharePoint. It's great. It's where it is. It's all good at the moment. Now, if I select SharePoint, please ignore the amount of connections I have. I need to do some cleaning. But we get our usual kind of bit up here. Now, if I choose the dev site and I choose, let's say, answers, and I hit connect, what that's going to do is that's just going to add a static reference right there. And that's not using the environment variable value. So we do the same thing if we want to add the environment variable value. We go to SharePoint, choose a connection, and then we have this little button over here, the advanced button. And then immediately you'll get connect using an existing environment variable, and you'll get a list of the environment variables that you have available to you. Now, these are all the site environment variable values. So if I choose SharePoint site, and then I go to advanced again, you can see I could choose SharePoint list and hit connect. And there we go. It's added that in as an environment variable value right there. So now if I hit insert and I go to gallery, I'm just going to drop a blank vertical gallery on there, and we're going to say that's SharePoint list. So you can see there, this is a SharePoint list. If I hit edit data on that, that's going to take me to that SharePoint site, which is a list of my current projects. Okay? Obviously not an extensive list, but for the purpose of for this, it works well. Um, but great. That's now pulling information from that SharePoint list using an environment variable. So we've got a gallery in there, we've got a SharePoint list in there, we've got an environment variable value in there. That's all well and good. We've pulled in our data source environment variable value. It works really well. And then we can just run with this. Now, we're going to publish this. That's Canvas apps. It's relatively easy to use use data source kind of environment variable values in this manner. Okay, we could just pull them in. Off we go. But how do we use them in Power Automate? Well, if you've been doing a lot of work in Power Automate, you might have seen this already pop up. And bear with me, I am using the old old designer just because the new one was running slow. But right here we have site address. Okay, so if I hit enter custom value just here, rather than selecting just from the site ones, you can see that I've got all my environment variables right there ready for me. So if I look at this and I go, ooh, I want to use the SharePoint site one, and we've got list here. Well, actually, I want to use my projects list. So I'm going to go and say that's SharePoint list. There we go. My environment variable values are now able to be used in Power Automate. Great. But how do they actually turn up? What do they look like? Kind of that side of things. Well, they'd look just like they would in terms of the value that you've defined. Do they actually work? It's always a good one. So if I hit save and then we just run a quick test on this, should run quickly as we've already got 2 items in there. Yep, perfect. So looking at that, you can see the site address that's been identified is that site address that I had defined in the data source. And then we have the list name. which is just the list ID reference. Simple as that. It's what turns up, and we can see there I've got my outputs, and I can see, hey, look, it's actually returned values. Great. They work just the same as any other dynamic content, which is all well and good. But we've seen obviously all of this being used in one environment, okay? All of it being kind of worked on and being able to be run in this environment. But what we're going to do now is we're actually going to go and try to import this into this solution into another environment. And we're then going to show how we get the prompt for changing things. I'm going to make sure I publish before anything. And we're going to show how we can use these environment variables to essentially change what site and what lists a application might be looking at. While we wait for publishing all customizations. Jace, while we wait for this to run through, do we have any questions at the moment?
It's been a solidly clear presentation as always, so we do not have a ton of questions yet.
Okay,
I bet people are saving them for the end.
not a problem.
However, you and I had a little bit of a talk a while back about self-taught developers.
Mm-hmm.
And listening to this, one thing that I just feel is this got to be one of those areas where self-taught developers might be not using this as much as they could compared to people who maybe have a bit more structured guidance.
Yeah,
Would
no,
you say
that's
that is accurate or?
yeah, very much so, very much so. The reason why is it just purely because obviously a lot of the learning materials we see out there are focused on directly connecting the information into the app, especially when it comes to SharePoint back canvas apps, right? So when you're self-taught, I'll hold my hands up. I was massively guilty of this in introducing when I first started and learning, introducing unmanaged layers into a managed solution. Okay. And all the time it was to do things like change the SharePoint site URL that's being referenced in a flow, change the list that's being referenced, and kind of doing that thing because I've got it in a different environment, but I can't change it. I have to introduce a manage layer, right? Um, this is definitely something worthwhile knowing. And not knowing it doesn't. The best way I could put it is not knowing it makes your life more difficult, but it's something that's easily missed. So we've actually got that solution exported now. So I'm going to import this. There we go. And what we're going to see, we can hope. So right here, these are all the environment variables that I had added to that solution. If we take a look back at the solution itself, we can see I've got a Boolean one, a Dataverse one, a JSON one, a SharePoint list one, a SharePoint site one, and a text one. Great. So I'm just going to add in just a standard JSON object. Let's go for there. Great. We've got our Boolean. We've got our text. Now, obviously, I mentioned I mentioned obviously about the kind of text and the bits, and we mentioned about the default value and the current value. Now, obviously, it's asking me to add all these in. Um, personally, I always try to just put a current value in. The only time I add a default value in is if it has to default to something, and it being blank is going to cause a severe issue. Um, the reason why is if you're importing and you forget to put something in here, or you miss it, or you just hit import, it's a pain to have to essentially it then starts running on the default, and it throws a bit of a fit. It reverts back to it. See there? Now I'm actually going to change this. So this SharePoint site was connected to Dev before. I'm now going to add it to PJBT book tracking, and I'm going to change the SharePoint list to PJBT book tracking. Now that's a completely separate list to what we had before, and a completely separate site to what we had before. I'm then also going to choose Dev Kitchen environment as a different Dataverse one, but we're going to use those SharePoint lists as a way to essentially just show what happens here. So while that's importing, Crispy, you've made a very good point. Naming standard in terms of naming convention. So this is something I might do another session on. Naming convention is massively important. I tend not to follow one for these demos because this is just a demo environment, but definitely worthwhile noting that you should have a naming convention for not only your environment variables, but any component within your solutions. And I mean any component, be that tables, Canvas apps, monitoring apps, anything else. It is massively important. And Microsoft does have a white paper on it. Apparently today we're taking a while to import a solution.
That weighted paper is probably something that I need to pick up as a bedtime reading.
I would definitely recommend. There are also a lot of community resources out there. So there's one I will shout out. So yeah, there's a Matthew Devaney one, but also there is a GitHub community project at the moment by a gentleman called Stuart Baxter. For those watching the recording, I will add a link to it in either the description or in the post that I put into the Discord. Um, but um, Lots of people who are really, really knowledgeable have contributed to it, and it's very, very, very good. There we go. So we can see here we've got our environment variables managed solution because technically I'm using this environment as a test environment, even though it says it's a dev, but we'll let that be for now. But we're going to go into this app, we're going to play it, and we're going to take a look at what it shows, of course. And there we go. We've now got an entirely different set of text and an entirely different list being presented in the gallery. All because all we've done is change that environment variable. And the same would be the case if I were to go into the environment variables flow here. I can hope it's a manually run flow in a managed environment, so this is going to be interesting. And I hit run. It's going to take a few seconds to run. Now, obviously, before when we looked at this, the site address was that site there, and the list name was that GUID there. When we look at this, we've got a different site address, and we've got a different list ID and a different set of returns. So I've changed what the Power Automate and the Power App is displaying, not by changing the inherent code in the Power App, but just purely by editing those environment variables. That is the power of it. That's what makes it so useful, is that you can actually inherently change how your app or flows operate and what data they return dependent on just those variables there and testing them. So, with all that being said, environment variables. Obviously, we have covered what they are, how they work, how we create them, they can be used for, and how they interact in terms of when we deploy an application, how we update them, and also what changes they can kind of cause. Now, with all that being the case, thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful and got to learn something new, and I'll see you in the next one.